It's a tiny trope with a surprisingly large impact, one that stems back to some of the very earliest mythology, and now pops up on screen in movies, shows, and even social media. From historic Irish tales of little people, to Swift's Lilliputians, the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids franchise, to watching people cook in tiny kitchens online. What's our eternal obsession with miniature people all about? Over the centuries, tiny people have been portrayed in a myriad of ways. They've been mischievous and magic, funny and fearsome, sinister and sweet. And once they made it on screen, those different portrayals were pushed even further, from fantasy into the realm of sci-fi. Part of the reason filmmakers return to tiny people on screen is also that it's technically impressive. Making humans look like they're no taller than a teacup poses a challenge, and we can really see the development of visual effects, and the fingerprints of different VFX artists in movies that feature them. From well-employed forced perspective to animatronics to CGI, artists and set designers have to be incredibly creative when it comes to creating these worlds. Often, it can seem like the plot is driven to an extent by how impressive the visuals can be.
Nick, it's one of your cookies!
You're never gonna believe it in school.
But no matter how far-fetched their stories, when they appear on screen, miniature people often tell us something important about human beings of all sizes.
Someday you'll meet someone your own size and you'll forget all about me.
I won't. I'll never forget you.
Because it's such a popular trope, there are multiple academic theories surrounding our obsession with miniature people. In an article called A Taste for Shrinking, Professor of Literature Sarah Higley writes that, in short, the miniature is power over the world of things that we would like to possess but do not. It is also exclusion from a space we would like to inhabit but cannot. This is true of many miniature people narratives, particularly in children's movies. We see children who are desperate to own the miniature people they meet.
My little person.
Who are you calling little?
Well, you are quite small.
And who are enchanted by their way of life, trying to weave themselves into it. Part of the great appeal of seeing many people in children's stories is their creativity, how they use our objects in different ways. So in The Borrowers, bottle caps become frying pans, walnut shells become helmets. It's a charming way of looking at the everyday, turning the things we often overlook into something more grand and fantastical. But these stories also explore the very real frustrations that come from being small. Frustrations that adults often forget about, but are very real for children, who can't always make their own decisions, buy their own things, or control their own lives.
Honey, when you say things like that, you make him feel about this big.
If he wants to feel big, he should act big.
In Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, all of the children are up against these issues in various different ways. In the Thompson family, teenager Russ fails to meet their dad's expectations, while his little brother Ron is desperate for genuine engagement from their dad, but he doesn't get it. Amy is a teenager, just growing into a phase of new responsibility, and experiencing the freedom and possibilities that come with it. Being shrunk poses a serious threat to her social plans. It's just yet another annoying instance of her family getting in her way.
We're now a quarter of an inch tall and 64 feet from the house.
Nick, I've got 6 hours to get home, get big, and get to the mall. Now get moving.
But in the end, all of the kids grow as people while they're shrunk. And their parents do too, forging friendships they didn't have before. In part, this is down to the terrifying experiences they have when they're tiny. They realize that if they can survive all of that, anything that can happen to them in their human size is surmountable. Likewise, in Alice in Wonderland, Alice feels protected by her human size. Although she's a child, when she's in Wonderland, she's often bigger than everyone else, which makes her feel able to call out the mean miniature adults.
Your Majesty, indeed. Why, you're not a queen. You're just a fat, pompous, bad-tempered old tyrant.
But the thing about Wonderland is that she never really knows when she'll shrink, and it puts her at greater risk when she does. In her PhD thesis on miniature narratives, Danielle Morse O'Connor writes that, from the earliest miniature narratives, there's been an insistence on miniature people's inferiority to and dependence on big people in the big world, and the conclusion that big people will always be dangerous and destructive to miniature people because of this innate hierarchy built into the differences in scale. In that way, miniature people narratives are also about making children feel responsible, teaching them how to care for things and people who are more vulnerable than they are.
There's plenty more. Plenty more. Your father risked his life for this potato.
Vulnerability is a big factor in miniature people movies made for adults, too. These stories often explore our worries and our needs on a new scale.
There's no medical precedent for what's happening to you. I simply know that you're getting smaller. The X-rays prove it beyond any doubt.
In one early iteration, The Incredible Shrinking Man, made in 1957, Scott's story unites many of the anxieties of the era.
I was continuing to shrink. What was I? Still a human being? Or was I the man of the future?
We see the looming threat of atomic war and the undermining of the patriarchal order. Scott is sprayed with a mysterious chemical and begins to shrink, battling to keep his role as the head of the household for a while, but ultimately becoming so small that he's freed from his need to provide. But this isn't the end of his troubles. Once he's tiny, he has to battle things that he never had to worry about when he was bigger, like a spider that's now bigger than him. In the end, he kills the spider, but realizes that he's still shrinking. In the philosophical and fairly tragic final scene, he's lost almost everything. But Scott says in voiceover narration that it doesn't matter how small he becomes, he has survived. He still exists.
My fears melted away, and in their place came acceptance. Yes, smaller than the smallest. I meant something too.
The Incredible Shrinking Man was parodied in the 80s movie The Incredible Shrinking Woman. Here, the concept of the shrinking wife is played for laughs. There's a lot of slapstick comedy, courtesy of lead actress Lily Tomlin, who plays Pat, a woman who's exposed to chemicals that end up shrinking her.
To my family, I'd become a doll. And to our dog, a chew stick.
But there's a darker political undertone to the film, too. The idea of the little wife has long been about keeping women down in traditional household roles.
Can't you just see it, Madame Gaston, his little wife?
And the film is enraging in this respect. Although Pat is shrinking and unable to fulfill her apparent duties as housewife, her family still doesn't lift a finger to help her.
Oh, Judith, I don't know. I just... Oh, honey, I guess we eat out again.
In a time when some were questioning if women had already stopped needing feminism, The Incredible Shrinking Woman showed just how small some women were still treated. In fact, in many of the shrinking person narratives for adults, the ideas sometimes switch from sweet and curious to downright dystopian. As writer Jeff Ewing wrote for Forbes when the second Ant-Man movie came out, shrinking technology would create the capacity for the world to become a totalitarian nightmare, with authoritarian governments spying on people left and right. Putting the miniature's dystopian lens onto the 21st century, 2017 sci-fi comedy Downsizing explores whether, in relation to our increasingly bleak prospects, the future of humanity could be in miniature. A famous scientist invents a way of shrinking people, claiming it could be the only thing that saves the human race. But when central character Paul meets an old friend who's undergone the process, we begin to realize that even when they're being told this is the only way to survive, humans still view the process selfishly.
Plus, it must feel good to know you're really making a difference.
You mean all that crap about saving the planet?
Yeah.
Downsizing is about saving yourself. It takes the pressure right off, especially money pressure.
Paul decides to downsize based on his friend's recommendation, but his wife backs out and leaves him, meaning he doesn't get the luxurious miniature lifestyle he wanted after all. He ends up meeting the creator of Downsizing, and he reveals that it's already too late anyways.
Environmental disaster, pandemic disease, unbreathable air, some combination of them all.
Do you really mean extinction? What about downsizing?
Yeah, too little, too late. Only 3% of the world has miniaturized.
And yet, with his new girlfriend Nyak, Paul decides to make the best of whatever time they do have left, and dedicates the rest of his life to helping others. It took him becoming tiny to turn him into a better man. Whether they're part of a vibrant, exciting story brimming with possibility and charm, or they're making the best of a miserable existence, the resilience of miniature people may be why we return to them again and again. They might not be the biggest, they may not be the strongest, but whatever they come up against, we know they're going to fight. In the climactic scene of the Borrowers movie, the Clock family, who've always lived a solitary life, are joined by thousands of other borrowers in their effort to bring down Ocious P. Potter.
We're not vermin, we're not freaks, and we're not pests. We may be small, but heaven help anyone who thinks he can squish us!
Children's literature professor Perry Nodelman writes, "When these small beings prevail over insurmountable odds, as they always do, they represent a potent version of the wish fulfillment fantasy. The very small can triumph over the dangerously large, the very powerless over the exceedingly powerful." And this is an element of the miniature person narrative that is extra appealing to today's audiences. When a few big people control our politics, our finances, and the way we communicate, we might feel small sometimes, but there's power in numbers. And that's why we predict we'll be seeing a lot more miniature people movies in the coming years. That's the take. Click here to watch the video we think you'll love, or here to check out a whole playlist of awesome content. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And make sure to subscribe to our Patreon for exclusive new videos.